welcome, Christine. I'm here today with the Executive Director of Native Land Digital, Christine Luckasavitch, and I'm going to read a brief bio for Christine, and we'll get into this conversation. So, Christine is a woman of the Madawaska River Algonquin people and belongs to the Crane clan. She is currently studying for her Master's of Arts in Indigenous Studies at Trent University. Christine is the owner and executive consultant of Wasaya Consulting and Wasaya Cultural Tours, two small businesses dedicated to reviving and celebrating Indigenous traditional knowledge and culture-based practices through educational opportunities. And of course, Christine is also the executive director of Native Land Digital, and we're here to discuss that today. And Christine, I couldn't be more excited because I've been a fan of your work for a long time, and there's so many interesting things to discuss in relation to it. So thank you for joining me here today.
Yeah, Chimigoj, thank you for having me.
So probably the best way to start, I think, is to kind of hand it to you. What is Native Land Digital?
So Native Land Digital is an open source digital resource that is, it's a map of Indigenous territories, languages, and treaties on a global scale. Majority of information is all community-based, including any, so basically anything that we source is from Indigenous knowledges and Indigenous perspectives. And then any changes or additions that are made to the map itself are also from Indigenous people. So basically, it's a community-based project, sort of like a content platform that holds information. Really, it's kind of it's like a starting point of information for folks to learn a little bit more about those Indigenous languages, treaties, territories around the world. But the nice thing is that it is it's governed by Indigenous folks. It started out as a project with a non-Indigenous person in 2014, 2015, when he was engaged in anti-pipeline activism and started to think a little bit more about, how can we learn more about the land? What's the deeper history? And he created this map, or at least the starting point of Native land. And over the years, it has evolved into a nonprofit organization that is Indigenous-led with an entirely Indigenous staff, and also a board of directors that is mostly Indigenous, also with some wonderful non-Indigenous allies. And we're also supported by an advisory council made up of experts in Indigenous cartographies on a global scale.
There are so many interesting things in even what you said right there that like jump out to me. So one, so a mapping project, and it shows you information on a map that most people are not used to seeing, right? People think maps, they think colonial boundaries, they think current nation states, they think US states, counties, towns. You really don't get insight into who is here, who has been here, what were the Indigenous lands, boundaries, overlapping in these boundaries. It's very enlightening. I'll just tell anybody who has not seen Native Land yet, both on the website, and then you guys have a really nice mobile app as well. You're going to get like an instant insight in just to seeing, you are global in your reach now, but just in North America and in the States, you're going to go, what? Oh, I never really thought that this was a territory that had kind of belonged to somebody before the US was created. And then, wait, what? Like, people are still here organizing, like caring. So it's just from the jump, it's enlightening. Also, just thinking about kind of the governance that you talked about. I do think that's very interesting that sort of a non-Indigenous founder on the project got into this work. I assume because they were curious and just thought, nobody is showing this to me, so maybe I can put it together. But then realized along the way, like, hey, this is bigger than me, and maybe I should bring in the real voices who can represent this and drive this properly. And then you guys formatting as a nonprofit too, I think is interesting on this as well, right? So I'm not sure how to, jump into kind of like unpacking on this. Maybe talk about sort of like the governance, right? Why it's important to have, and why the founder, Victor, thought that this was important to have too. And how that kind of like founding the board sort of interfaces with people who are contributing information to make sure that it feels and is genuine.
Yeah, so there's a lot in there. I think kind of the first place to start is, with the map itself. When you look at it, it's just this like a colorful tapestry, right, of overlapping shapes and so on. And I think it's interesting to look at Indigenous understandings of land and territories, cartographies, and so on, as opposed to what we're so used to in a Western world where, lines are sharp and straight and imaginary through the forest. And so when you're instead prioritizing Indigenous knowledges and you're able to actually see a representation of just how complex those interrelationships are from Indigenous nation to Indigenous nation, particularly when you do not give space to those colonial understandings of Indigenous identity. So really what we're doing is completely prioritizing Indigenous knowledges, the ways that we exist in the world, the ways that we know that we exist in the world, whether or not we may be federally recognized or not, or working to become federally recognized. And so with that, having particularly around conversations with land, belonging, identity, and really Indigenous knowledge overall, Victor Temprano, who started the project, he's done a really beautiful job of creating a content platform where Indigenous knowledges are prioritized, but in knowing that you need to treat Indigenous knowledges with care, respect, and so on. Because ultimately those knowledges and anything to do with those knowledges, practices, and so on, as well as determining who belongs, who doesn't, or really how we belong and so on. There are all of these different complexities, but they're only for Indigenous folks to determine. It's only the responsibility of Indigenous peoples to tell our stories, to talk about who we are, to talk about what our histories are, to talk about what our futurisms are going to be. And so from there, having a really strong Indigenous and settler relationship, those balances where we can make sure that Indigenous knowledge is prioritized, but also that we're a teaching tool for folks who need to learn more about Indigenous belongings on land and so on.
No, I love it. And I got to say that I feel like a lot of people who are kind of tuning into this conversation and work, there's just that reflexive self-reflection, wait, I'm a settler? What does that mean? Or the nature of the work that we do with Regrid, we map land boundaries, right? And this is part of what makes us a very curious team about what we do, because when you map the colonial property boundaries, which is another term that a lot of people coming in from the outside don't think of, settler and colonial. It's interesting. Didn't that kind of happen a long time ago? And it's well, in a sense, maybe. Actually, no. And these two systems are sort of overlaid on top of each other. And I feel what's amazing about what you do, and this is something that I'm still trying to process how we can do a better job of doing this, is take the work of the Native Land Digital and the territories that are defined and shared by Indigenous communities and merge them with a contemporary understanding of for lack of a better term, the real estate and landscape, the real estate and just however people think about land. Because people in the US, they think about land as real estate. You know what I mean? It's just it's Zillow. It's, you buy low, sell high, get your nice house, all this fancy stuff. And there's just really no consciousness about how these two things come together. One of the things that your website says, which I just think is such a beautiful sort of, I don't know if you'd call this a mission statement, but it puts forward that Native Land Digital strives to create and foster conversations about the history of colonialism, Indigenous ways of knowing, and settler Indigenous relations through educational resources. In doing so, Native Land Digital creates spaces where non-Indigenous people can be invited and challenged to learn more about the lands they inhabit, the history of those lands, and how to actively be a part of a better future going forward together. I'm not sure if you can talk a little bit about that, because I imagine that's got to be a very interesting dynamic. On the one hand, a project that is for Indigenous people and communities to map these areas, the languages, the history for yourselves, but then also inviting in this audience, which is more naive, which is maybe thirsty to learn, which is maybe kind of has questions about what does this mean? What do I do with it? Can you talk more about for your ideal audience, are there maybe two audiences where it's getting all the Indigenous knowledge and communities together to share and to build this, but then also inviting in this audience who's going to be very green to this conversation, right? And that just maybe talk about that balance of getting the biggest audience possible, but wanting to keep it bottom up from Indigenous people themselves.
Yeah. So the biggest thing is that Native land is a we're creating a space for Indigenous stories, right? So ultimately, the work that we do is for Indigenous peoples, for Indigenous communities, and that even goes into, you know, data sovereignty practices and the ways that we handle information, the ways that we handle conversations, the principles and ethics that we work on, and so on. So primarily, we're doing this for Indigenous people around the world. But we are in such a position where we can also play a really, you know, helpful tool in at least giving folks a starting point of where they can start to learn more about whose land that they're on, so that they can then, you know, kind of go out of this digital space where they're looking at territory and locating themselves into the world, but then pull it out into like a physical realm where you have a responsibility to be in relationship with those Indigenous folks who are still there, despite ongoing colonialism, because though we like to say, you know, it happened a long time ago, but no, it didn't. It's still completely ongoing, right? Like there's still many different sorts of traumas and issues and so on that we continue to live with as a result of colonialism, which continues to be perpetuated through a lot of the narratives, through government policies and so on. And so really, like, Native land all in all is like this, like, counter, it's like a counter history. It's a counter tool to like upset that normal narrative that, you know, if you look at land, for example, that narrative that land, as you had said, land is like a commodity. Land is like a resource, right? Like that whole idea of like natural resources and all of that. But what if we are able to encourage folks to have a different relationship with the land that they're on, so that they can then understand that stuff's not just there for consumption. You're in relationship with these beings that are around you, human, other than human, seen and unseen. And so just encouraging folks to have that deeper understanding that there's more to life. There's a lot more to it than the narratives that we've been commonly told and taught and so on in this culture that we live in, that's like basically pummeling toward potential demise, right? Self-demise. So we have to take a step back a little bit, really rework the ways that we approach land, the ways that we approach each other. And that starts from like really shifting our understandings and like decolonizing the understandings that we hold about the places that we live, the places we visit, and how we interact with the world as a whole.
Do you feel like the thirst for that is growing? It seems to me that, this is just my own internal temperature gauge, but it does seem to me that people broadly have a greater recognition about, if they don't know how they should be relating to the land, there's more open-mindedness about what are we actually doing to the world. And I'll say too, from what you said, like honestly, for Native land, like no joke, anybody listening, like I don't know where else you'd find this information laid out this way. Like if you want additional insight about where you currently live and what was happening here and who was here prior to and still since the US was founded, I just don't know another resource that's as helpful. I know that I've personally used some information from the service to go deeper into looking at local history. And the deeper you look, just the more interesting insights you're going to find. And I think, you know, one of the tensions that I'm currently experiencing on this is like there's the high level kind of education piece of like, okay, who was here originally? What were they kind of up to? What can I like read in the book? But then there's also this kind of question that maybe you can speak to about like, what have you seen people do once they've sort of been educated? Because I sort of know from personal experience or just personal feelings, I guess, like once you kind of get an awareness, there's always a question of like, well, what do I kind of do next? And that kind of can create a very awkward sort of feeling, because you're like, am I supposed to talk to like, you know, like Indigenous people near me? Am I supposed to go to the local tribe? Is there anything I can like actually do? And I know that can be like an irritating question, because on the one hand, there's not always a lot to do. On the other hand, it's like, don't bother people. But I'm curious, like what you've seen people get engaged with when they've sort of like begun increasing their awareness.
Yeah. So, I mean, it ranges, right? Like it ranges from, say, Native land being in museums to help to illustrate a territory acknowledgement, that to incorporating Native land API, so open source data that can be applied to whatever sort of project you may be working on. But then, you know, so instead of prioritizing, say, that colonial understanding of a particular land boundary or a particular land, a geographical region or something like that, they instead use the native land map to then show people, whose territory you're on. So Regeneration Canada, so they look to like soil remediation and so on with farms across Canada. They incorporated the native land map because the use of sustainable soil practices and land stewardship is deeply rooted in Indigenous knowledges. So for them, who, they're deeply rooted in a lot of these sustainability practices that come originally from Indigenous folks, they wanted to find a way at least to inherently honor those practices by showing that, here's the location of farms that are participating, but prioritizing Indigenous territories. So everything from that to, just for example, when folks are visiting wilderness spaces, national parks, and so on, finding out whose territory they're on or traveling to. And I think, or at least I hope, that it creates a better consciousness that, this isn't just whatever national park or state park that you're in, but this is still Indigenous territory, even if there are no Indigenous folks who are still able to be on that land or still able to have access on the land itself. So it does shift consciousness a bit, I hope. But then to go into kind of another one of your questions is, when you find out whose land you're on, that's good, but you have to do something with it. So same thing as something like a land acknowledgement. Land acknowledgement's great, good to acknowledge the land that you're on, but unless there's action that is associated, like, you should have to change, or you should really change the entire way that you live your day-to-day life as a result of knowing that you're on Indigenous territories. And so, like, really easy starting points, making sure that you're not overburdening local communities, right? Because we're doing a lot of other things. But read books by Indigenous authors, listen to Indigenous podcasts, giving a shout out to folks like All My Relations podcast.
I would love, and I think people would appreciate more of those too. So like, All My Relations, you list as resource, and any other things like that. I feel like that's just so helpful, as a gateway into more. So please.
Yeah, no, All My Relations podcast, I would absolutely recommend. Read books by Vine Deloria Jr. So giving context, like I live in what's now known as Canada. So my intimate knowledge of, US and state policies and what that means for Indigenous folks is not as, in depth as it is here in Canada. But there's so much Indigenous brilliance that helps to share what those stories are a lot deeper. So, for example, like Abigail Echohawk would be a great place to start to learn about what the impact of COVID has been on Indigenous communities, particularly rural or urban Indigenous folks. There's one book that keeps on like coming to mind, and though it is a Canadian context, is My Conversations with Canadians by Lee Miracle, who passed away in the last year. But what she does is she talks to the reader as though you're sitting around a kitchen table. She really goes through explaining, like, these are the impacts of colonialism. These are the impacts of us not being able to access our ancestral territories or our ancestral knowledge. This is where you have to do better. This is what we need from you. And this is just like, it's pretty much one of the most beautiful conversations in book format. But really, like any Indigenous author, any Indigenous podcast, Indigenous artists as well too, like, just start to follow, start to engage, start to interact more. You don't necessarily have to go and talk directly to community and say, hey, can you tell me more? We don't have time for that, but there are thousands and thousands of often free resources for you to use to learn more.
I remember that's so important, because I think it is hard for people to find, because you see Indigenous artists, at least in my opinion, maybe I'm sure I'm missing things, but just represented so infrequently on like the national cultural stage. Like, I think recently, like, I watched Reservation Dogs, and it was just sort of like cool to see that was like being held up as like, here's a whole ensemble and writer, actor, like everything, put together by Indigenous creators. I remember when I was like a teenager, you know, and not to date myself, but like, you know, the internet makes it easier to find all this stuff, of course, too. I remember like one of the first indigenous, you know, artists or creators that I came across was that, and forgive me, I haven't thought about this in years, it's just coming to mind, but Alexi Sherman, when Smoke Signals was like in the local independent theater, just finding this kind of stuff. And I think people have a thirst for this. So we'll definitely help share some more of these resources of where people can just go to get tuned in and informed. While you're talking, like something that was coming to my mind here, I'm just kind of thinking about like personal experiences using native land and map information and kind of like digging further into things. And it makes me wonder, you know, about some of the places that you want to take the platform and the mapping project in the future. So my wife, Mary, and I live in like a pretty interesting part of the US, I think, just in the fact that first off, it doesn't look like it should be part of the US. It kind of looks like we should be a part of Canada. We're kind of in the middle of Lake Superior in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. And a really unique history here. The winters are so severe that it's not a big population base, but what built this place out historically was the abundant native copper that you find here. And it has more pure native copper than you find anywhere near the surface on Earth, like literally like come pick up giant chunks. And so the history here is all copper mining. So the history you hear talked about is like industrial copper mining, super extractive, right? It was active here for about 100 years of just hardcore burrow a mile under the earth, get as much copper out as possible, smash the rocks, throw the waste rocks into some of the smaller lakes, which are now polluted from that. But the deeper history, when you look behind it too, is indigenous people were actually mining copper from here in different ways for thousands of years, if I'm not mistaken. You know, and it was traded all across North America. I know like the people have traced it definitively down to like Alabama and that far south. And as I was reading the history, because you can find some history about the indigenous mining here, but one of the things that really stood out to me was that most of the very successful industrial copper mines here were built directly on indigenous mines, meaning like the exploration and the work had been done to understand where this material was. And then it was kind of like, okay, we'll go here. And so it was this sort of like taking of the work and the exploration and that history that had already happened. And this kind of repeats everywhere in the country, right? Like before this conversation, I mentioned that being in Detroit, you know, a main street like Michigan Avenue, that was an indigenous trail that went all the way to Chicago. And it was people knew the land, they knew the best paths, they knew the best resources. And that was sort of like written over and claimed, like everything was just kind of invented, right? Or like discovered anew. And so that brings me to ask, like, I'm curious for native land and the map and the app, how granularly can people contribute information? Like, are you looking at like particular like places like indigenous mines or indigenous pathways? Because I don't, and forgive me if I'm missing it, but right now in the app, it's not that like, you know, it doesn't work like a Google map, so to speak, right? Where it's like you could navigate just from like, here are all these points with their indigenous names or history. But how do you kind of view that as you think about like contributions that people can make to the map, or how granular and local this can go?
Yeah. So there's so much.
There is, which is good. No, it's good.
So the first thing that I'll say though is, the appropriation of indigenous knowledge extends far beyond, natural resources, into every sort of indigenous knowledge possible, right? Knowledge practice. So it's not just, mining industries, it's right across the whole board. Just wanted to put that point in there too. But then, sort of one of the first things that you asked was what's next for native land? Like, where are we going? And it kind of ties in a little bit to, what that granular level would be. But we are in the process of creating community pages that will be there for Indigenous nations, communities, and so on to use as they need. So we will help and assist in whatever way possible, giving any support that folks need. We just want to make sure that there's a place for them to tell their stories, and that can be anything from a someone's new novel being released, or an art exhibit, right? Or talking about land back in that particular region, and so on. And so really those community pages then allow for like that kind of granular level of information about certain communities, certain tribes, and so on. But what I will say overall, when it comes to contributing information to Native land, so we always welcome suggestions, we always welcome those fixes, corrections, and so on. But then what happens when those fixes and so on, when they're sent in, is then they then go into like kind of like our research software, where we log it into like, this is what someone has requested, you know, it's connected to this and that other project. And then it just kind of, we work through basically that long to-do list that's informed by request for community. And so certainly, like, as long as it is information that is relevant, as long as it is information that is based in truth, and particularly if it's information that is from Indigenous peoples, or of, I'll even say, of benefit to Indigenous folks, that is something that we would include. So for anyone who hasn't actually been on the website yet, once you go to the map, once you locate where it is that you're looking at, the next step is to go to what we call nation pages. And that's where you see like a kind of zoomed in version of that particular region that you're looking at. But then it also lists additional websites for you to learn more. And then it also lists additional maps. But then too, it also shows a change log, which I think is pretty cool. It's like the amount of times that we've edited that one particular page. And then it's always followed by a contact us. And that's how you can reach out if you want to send us more information, because we're certainly happy to have it, because we are a super small team. All of us are part-time, and there's no possible way that we can know to include all of these different elements. So if folks are willing to reach out to share things with us, that's how we can make sure that it gets included on the map.
That's great. Yeah, you guys do a really good job. It's sort of like the aggregation of different resources. You point to different websites and different historical documents and things of that nature that people contribute. Maybe you can talk. So one thing I'm very interested in figuring out like best ways for people to be supportive of this work, because I would have to imagine, so nonprofit, you mentioned part-time staff for the most part on things like, but this idea is so big. I mean, like, one of the things that's so compelling about this work, and I congratulate you on this, congratulation in quotes, perhaps to a degree, because it's an endless project, right? But it sounds like you're the right kind of person and the right team to kind of take on an endless project, right? Because you guys are so passionate about it. Because there's no place that this ends. It just kind of goes on forever and gets better, gets richer, and gets more interesting. What can people do? Because I'd have to imagine, and forgive me if any of this is off base, but like, so one thing, obviously everybody needs resources. So money is an obvious resource. So like donations and funding, but contributions, like you mentioned, people, having, hey, this is not on the site, but it should be. This is not on the map, but it should be. But also like technical and engineering talent. Like, what are the, because, again, you building this, it's a functional content management system on top of the map box, base map. You all are equipped to like really make an advanced interactive map. I mean, you already have, but that you're on the path to like continue to make it richer. What do you need on the engineering resources too? Or like, what would be helpful? I saw you guys were hiring for like a front end engineer recently, but how could people who are just very interested in this kind of tune in to provide talent or other resources?